Look, welcome everybody, and thank you, Stella and Chad, for all their work, and the members of the US delegation to Sydney. We've had our journey this week, starting in Melbourne, Canberra. We have met with... by the way, let me just start and say why are we here. This is a celebration of common sense. This is a celebration with an effort to share ideas, hello Run, share ideas on strengthening the alliance between the United States and Australia. Simple as that. It's simply looking at ways in which we can together as good citizens in a democracy strengthen the alliance between the United States and Australia. And the reason I'm wearing this cap is, apart from the fact that it's a superhero, is peace through strength. If you do not go with your allies who are loyal or have similar values in a democracy, where are you? You cannot have, and this may be a political statement and I do not care, you cannot be backing a communist regime alone. You need to have friends everywhere and work in harmony with other people in the world. And the best ally we have as a nation, and has been for over 150 years, is the United States. And that is how it will remain. And that is bipartisan, it's apolitical, it's not political, there's no games, there's no deflection. I don't have a teleprompter, I don't need something here to read. This is just said from me, from my heart and from the centre of my head. My name is Charles Kiefel, I'm the Chair of the Australian Advisory Board on Competitiveness. I welcome the President and Chief Executive, they're a distinguished American. He's the President of the US Council on Competitiveness, who's had this role for 24 years. We're grateful, Deborah, for you to come here. A highly decorated and recognised, well-respected public servant of the United States, a leader in different fields, has 7 doctorates. She has been President for 24 years. She was inaugural President and formed the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils, which has a membership of over 30 nations globally. Both organisations have a similar objective to share best practice in ways to showcase business models and other models, whether universities, laboratories or corporations and leaders are gathering in networks of leaders to share best practice to aim to improve productivity, lift productivity, and ultimately through competition by comparison or microeconomic competition or macroeconomic competition, different forms of competition and productivity. It could be labour market productivity, capital markets productivity, more productive utilisation of scarce natural resources, productivity in education, which Run is going to address in leading today, and I'll go into that in a moment very quickly. So there are different ways of achieving productivity. So the aim is basically to improve productivity for prosperity, improve the standard of living of member countries. Those are member countries. So those are people that are with us in this journey together. We have lots of meetings globally. We have lots of meetings over the years, and it's been highly successful. I met Deborah in 2013. I was fortunate to become a distinguished fellow in 2016. I have different roles. Deborah can expand on that if she wishes. It's not important. But the other distinguished fellows I should recognise with me is Australians. Just for those Australians here, Arthur Sinodinos is Deputy Chairman of the Australian Advisory Board on Competitiveness. He took that role, accepted to take on that role just a month ago. And the roles are all honorary. They're not paid for. These are people who are committing their own time and goodwill to aim to improve to fulfil the values that we are putting together in the Alliance. The other distinguished fellows are Alexander Downer, John Anderson, Greg Hunt and Manny Pole. They're the other distinguished fellows. And then there are Australian members of the GFCC, which we'll come to another time. But today with the panels, we're having a panel on higher education, a panel on artificial intelligence, technology and ways of improving innovation. We're looking at panels on natural resource competition, and at the end we'll have a declaration of our agreement to sign together with a number, about 10 points, where we are forming an agreement to advance further to strengthen the alliance. So I'll stop there and introduce Deborah, who and we're grateful, Deborah, for you to come here. I've mentioned her resume is long. I can go on about her resume, but you've got the details there on the file. You can see how much effort she's given to this cause for a long time, 24 years, after previously working in the Reagan administration as Assistant Director in Policy for Science and Technology. Then she went on to become the Chief Executive and President, as I mentioned, and she's been very loyal and supportive of me and Australia, to which we are grateful. We did form an original agreement with the Department of Industry, Science and Technology in 2017. It was signed in 2018. During COVID, we did run a GFCC, which is different to the US Council, but it's still similar in terms of values and objectives. In 2019, during COVID, we had a virtual gathering, and then again, this is the second physical meeting of members of the US Council visiting Australia. So, Deborah, would you like to take the baton from here? Are you happy with that? Is that right? Yeah? Well done. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Charles, for your very kind introduction and your framing remarks for what we're going to do and accomplish today. And what a beautiful venue, and the weather is pretty perfect now. Coming from rainy, cold Canberra to have this view of Sydney is quite a pleasure. I want to welcome everyone for this inaugural U.S.-Australia Innovation Dialogue. We're very excited to have a great delegation from the United States, joined by very strong leaders from the private sector in Australia to discuss some of the critical challenges and opportunities facing our respective nations in a time of great turbulence, transition, and transformation. I want to recognize a few colleagues that are very much involved with the work of the U.S. Council on Competitiveness and our leadership. Two executive committee members are here with us. President Suresh Garmella, the president of the University of Arizona, one of our leading great research universities, and Dr. Mark Peters, the president and CEO of MITRE Corporation, as well as others. And I want to also recognize my colleagues, Chad Evans, the executive vice president and COO of the U.S. Council, and Dr. Roberto Alvarez, who's come from Brazil, the executive director of the GFCC. Both of these organizations, as Charles has said, are very committed to the bilateral U.S.-Australia relationship and Australia's very important global role in making the business case for why competitiveness policies, why competitiveness strategies are really a very powerful framework to address all the issues really that impact talent, technology, investment, and infrastructure. I often say in the United States, we could have the best tax policy, the best regulatory environment, the best research and development, the most skilled workforce, the best trade policies, whatever. But it's how they work together in an integrated system that create the productivity and the prosperity and the value for the nation, as opposed to being addressed in silos where you could deal with an antitrust issue, but if you don't look on how it affects your technology companies, you may be doing something that will hurt the overall system. So competitiveness policy is all about understanding the verticals, but also then being a systems integrator. It's my pleasure, of course, to recognize and the leadership and commitment of my friend and colleague, Charles Kiefel, and really our strategic partner here in Australia for many years. I think we all know him in the room, but he has had an incredible career as the founder and executive chairman of the Principles Fund, but it was really his vision and leadership to found the Australian Advisory Board on Competitiveness. And I have to say, his commitment to that partnership has been unparalleled. But last year, when we had our Global Federation of Competitiveness Council meeting in Belfast, Charles was elected to be the vice chair of the GFCC. So we thank you for your commitment to that as well. You mentioned our great group of distinguished fellows here in Australia in the GFCC, and I know Arthur Sinodinos will join us shortly. But we do have a growing group of corporate members, including NetLinks with James DeSolis, Principal Funds, and Monash University and Western Sydney. And we hope many of you in the room will decide to join that journey of competitiveness through the GFCC to help us shape the global environment for free trade, for a regulatory and capital and talent environment that will, yes, advance our own interests, but raise all boats around the world. And we will be hosting our 2025 Global Innovation Summit and meeting in Pittsburgh this year at the end of October, hosted by the Chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh, Joan Gable, and the President of Carnegie Mellon, and many other leaders will be coming from around the world. For those of you who don't know the U.S. Council, as Charles said, I've been the President and CEO for some years, but I was the first Assistant Secretary of Technology in the Commerce Department in the first Bush administration when the Council was formed by a tremendous leader of American industry, John Young. At the time, he was the CEO and chairman of Hewlett-Packard. He recently died, actually, in his early 90s, and there have been wonderful obituaries and stories about him, including his real innovation in creating the Council on Competitiveness. He was chairing President Reagan's Commission on Industrial Productivity. We were dealing, in the mid-'80s with all the technology and trade competition with Japan. And the president at the time established this Commission on Productivity to address these, and it was John Young's vision, we need a private sector group that brings together CEOs from all sectors of our economy, joining with our university presidents and our labor leaders to, one, define competitiveness, how are we going to measure it, but most important, what's the action agenda that the country needs to take in a bipartisan way to push forward prosperity and growth for all our citizens. And so while the issues have changed over the years, the mission is still the same. And we've had tremendous leadership of the U.S. Council, currently finishing his term, Brian Moynihan, the CEO and chair of Bank of America. But we've had a huge impact on policy. The famous American Competes Act, endorsed by both Presidents Bush and Obama. We've just played a big role the last few years in the CHIPS Plus Science Act that's very much at the forefront of the revitalization of our semiconductor industry. And we launched in 2020 our major platform, the National Commission on Innovation and Competitiveness Frontiers. It has some 60 leaders in it. And I mention that because in December of this year, we released our action agenda to the new Trump administration. And many of the things we called out are now moving forward, as they did when we released our first report in the Biden administration. We called for a nuclear moonshot. We called for bringing the corporate tax rate down to 21%. We called for having an innovation-friendly regulatory environment, fast-tracking permitting, cutting all the red tape. We called for returning our historic investment in R&D that was 2.5% in the 1960s, back to that level. Without that seed corn, we will not have the innovation of the future. We called for doubling down on educating Americans in science, technology, and engineering, to have a National Defense Act 2.0 to educate these young people that are going to be leading the future. We also called, and we saw this in action at Monash actually, what we call place-making innovation, bringing the innovation capacity and capability throughout the country, not just in Silicon Valley and Boston and Austin and Chicago. And it's a very robust agenda, and one of the very important anchors also is technology diplomacy. Namely, we need to work and partner with those nations that, as Charles said, share our values, are close allies, and that will be working with us to shape a world that's in great turmoil now, and we all know those issues. I could spend, I think, a lot of time talking about China, but I won't, because we kind of know what we're dealing with, that's all right, with China. They have massive investments in R&D. They are working to rewrite the rules of the global economy. They have taken leadership positions in most international organizations. It's hard to believe that China is the head of the World Intellectual Property Organization when their theft of intellectual property in the U.S. back in 2013 was about $800 billion. I'm on the Commission for the Theft of American Intellectual Property, and in our first report back in 2013, chaired by the former CEO of Intel, if China implemented their intellectual property laws back then, we would have 1.3 trillion more in GDP. So China is really the strategic issue we have to deal with going forward, and also recognize that all the technologies that are reshaping our future in AI and quantum and biotech and materials and energy and precision agriculture and space, and the list goes on, are all dual use. They have profound impact for our economies, but our national security as well. Australia is an anchor in the Indo-Pacific region, and I think this is another reason that we need to really deepen the relation, because the Indo-Pacific region now accounts for more than 1/3 of global GDP and nearly 60% of the world's population. But Australia is the core center of gravity and influence, and in many ways has become the battleground for influence over the exponential technologies, values, and strategic alliances. So our relationship, yes, built on our history, our trust, our collaboration in world wars and defense and innovation, but also in investment, in sharing of capital, and workforce development needs to really expand at this critical time. And so we're very excited to be here today for this launch of the Strategic Innovation Alliance Dialogue. Our countries really are poised to co-develop and deploy at speed and scale the massive, complex, dual-use technologies that are really at the heart of the future. As President Xi said, and echoed by President Putin, whichever country controls AI will control the world. And they said this a good 6 years ago. Space collaboration, defense, all of these things, we are the two nations with our other partners and allies that need to lead the world. And so with that, I'd like to really turn to you, Charles, for a little discussion on this partnership and relationship, but also take the opportunity to hear from you on some of your views on competitiveness.
Sure. Well, firstly, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think we need
Okay. Good, it's on. Firstly, thank you very much. Excellent, as always. And the first question I'd like to ask you is, what do you see as the achievement so far in the relationship we've had? Because there have been three, I see. One, perhaps the Lockheed Martin winning of the Space Agency in Adelaide, which you and I introduced, I think, to Arthur Senadine. Welcome, Arthur. Arthur Senadine, another great Australian over there, distinguished fellow, just walked in. Nice having dinner last night, Arthur. Enjoy that. So that was the first one. Arthur was instrumental in helping that, along with Greg Hunt, which culminated in Lockheed Martin winning the Space Agency in South Australia. It's number one. Number two, I think CSIRO, the CSIRO, became a member of the US Council, yes, and perhaps you could expand on that relationship. The third is elevating the imperative of productivity or competitiveness models to reach to achieve more productivity within Australia in different types of productivity. Would you like to comment on those three, or have I missed something out?
Well, I think you covered them very nicely, Charles, but I will comment on CSIRO because we met with Doug Hinton, the new CEO of CSIRO, when we were in Melbourne on Monday, and we didn't have too much time, but in the time we had, we saw so much synergy of interest for collaboration, building on what we launched in our first delegation under the U.S. Council to Australia in 2019. We had a tremendous group of CTOs. Former CEO of CSIRO, Larry Marshall, was involved. And coming out of that meeting, I know that there were many partnerships that were launched between Australian partners and U.S. partners at our national labs. CSIRO, has an office in Silicon Valley. They had no relationship whatsoever to the National Laboratory Complex in the United States. And we made all that happen. And we'll talk about that later this morning. So CSIRO is a very important institution, foundational institution in Australia, and has such a broad mission that extends into commercialization, which is actually better for you than some of our federal government agencies that don't quite have that mandate that takes you all the way to commercialization. The other thing I think that we've accomplished through the relationship is the recognition that we can't do things sort of slowly and plod along, that we need to work at scale and speed, and the world now is very, very different. You know, when former Minister Greg Hunt and the Ministry of Industry, Trade, and Innovation that Minister then Sinodinos led, we signed our MOU, you know, they supported the work of the GFCC financially, with staff, with leadership. And so they were going to host our big 2020 Global Innovation Summit. But the subject that they chose was very prescient. It was the intersection of competitiveness, productivity, and health. And little did we know we'd have the pandemic. But they launched an incredible meeting. I think it was one of the first global virtual meetings, every time zone in the world, and we managed to deliver it. So that was quite an accomplishment. But going forward, I think we need to address some real action-oriented initiatives. And one I'll mention, and maybe I'll save it for the end of the day, relates to not just critical materials and rare earths in research, but how we can join forces in actually manufacturing and processing these materials, because that is the bottleneck, is China controls the processing of these very strategic minerals for the future.
You've nailed that. That's a key point. Well, we're going to talk about that in the last session on resource competition, because competition or resource productivity, because we've got a lot of uranium. 28% of the world's reserve uranium, most of it's sitting idle in the ground, unproductive, not used. We'll talk about that later. But going back at the moment, best practice examples within the US Council of what you've done really well. Now, I've raised, actually on the Ross Greenwood show, benchmarking. Now, you've done benchmarking, and I'd be grateful for your views as how you think that's progressed, where you benchmark the base case, then you monitor the performance of your competitor's position along the journey. Do you want to expand on how that's progressed?
Well, the U.S. Council actually created the first competitiveness index in the world back in the late 80s with Michael Porter at Harvard, and developed a set of metrics and economic data to evaluate U.S. performance around, you know, GDP and number of researchers, standard of living indices and things, and it really was adopted by the World Economic Forum. And the problem with indices now, Charles, is that things are moving so fast and the data lags so far that to get the hardcore economic data, you're looking back, you know, 3 and 5 years to get it. And then if you're looking at where we are today, I mean, just look in the last, year and a half, what's happened in nuclear energy? Who would have dreamed, you know, that we're refitting the old nuclear plants, 3 Mile Island, massive investment. You know, that would never be captured in an index. But having said that, I think in the case of Australia, you haven't done competitiveness indexing, and I think it would be worth your while to do that and make that perhaps a flagship product of the advisory board on competitiveness, to undertake that and team with some of your great researchers here in Australia and CSIRO.
Sure. I'll come back to that index, because just on the index, I'll make one comment. Lots of politicians talk about productivity. You need productivity. Association leaders say, we must have productivity. But I challenge them, what exactly do they mean? How do you measure productivity? I mean, you can pontificate about the concept of productivity, but how do you measure productivity? You have to put a stake in the ground, a yardstick, then measure it. You can't just say, we need to be more productive. That is superficial, and frankly, it's frivolous.
Well, you have the classic, economic definitions of productivity, so much output per hour that's, measured in hardcore economic statistics. I mean, the United States, quite frankly, had a productivity gap, and we addressed that in partnership with Gallup, the long-term decline in U.S. productivity, and it really led to our establishing the National Innovation Commission. But our productivity compared to the productivity across Europe is soaring. And what does that mean? It impacts standard of living. It impacts wage. You know, in the UK now, it's very sad. I mean, their standard of living is about 2/3 less than the United States on the average. And then you couple that to the cost of energy being 2 to 3 times higher in the EU writ large, and a regulatory environment out of the EU that is very anti-competitive. I mean, I don't know how many in the room have read the Draghi report on competitiveness, but I strongly urge you to read that because it paints a very, very dark picture in Europe unless they get on with the productivity agenda to increase their output, but also the standard of living for their citizens, because that's what it's all about.
Sure. That's a very good point. On productivity, we have discussed before tax rate, corporate tax rate. That's one of my, can you hear me now? We talk about corporate tax rate. Now, the Australian corporate tax rate is 30%, Singapore 17%, the United States 21%. So I've been provocative and raised the point, why doesn't Australia be really competitive and drop the corporate tax rate to 15%, which is lower than Singapore? Why not? And somebody asked me, a commentator on television, what does that mean? There's more tax loss. Well, it's not actually, because if you have a lower tax rate, there's more investment in Australia, there are more jobs. So more jobs, there's more investment, potentially more income, and more jobs. Now, what do you think of that idea?
Well, I believe, you know, the tax arbitration is an issue that's been around for a long time, and we think in the United States that having a corporate tax rate, you know, down now to 21% is going to be a very strategic advantage. And in fact, this is interesting and shows the power of our organization, because it's not just CEOs, it's not just university presidents, it's not just labor leaders, it involves all of them. We had an endorsement back in 2017 to lead to getting a territorial tax system. You know, the United States was one of the only 2 countries in the world that our profits of our companies overseas were taxed where they were made and then taxed when they brought back to the United States. Yep. So you should get, I mean, look, Ireland has used tax arbitration to get a lot of infrastructure in Ireland, and they pay the penalties to the EU, but the penalties are so much less than the money they make that they continue to use tax to attract industry. But I think you should move in Australia to get a 21% tax rate.
Very good point. Now, Stella, how much time do we have here? Because I have one more question of Deborah. Sorry? Running out of time? Right.
Well, I didn't get my question.
One more question.
You.
One more question. Some Canadian investors have asked me, why is it in Australia, where you seem to have enough gas for 1,000 years in Victoria, it's not used, not explored and developed, and why in Australia you have 28% of the world's reserves of uranium and it's not dug up and used because of the prohibition? Does it surprise you that Australia's electricity bill is not $1 a year? If we used all the gas and all the uranium to build a nuclear power and process it in Australia, does it surprise you why Australia, as a great nation, has all these natural resources and precious earth minerals in the ground not being used? Does that surprise you?
Well, it not only surprises me, I think it's not a current or strategic decision of policymakers. And I've learned we've all learned a lot about this during our time here. And it's interesting that the older generation seems to be very much against the nuclear issues, proliferation, worried about waste, versus the younger. But I do think that you need to develop, I'm jumping ahead for the end of the day, you have to have a bipartisan coalition on this. You have to have leaders from Labor and the Liberal Party come together to make this something for the country, not associated with either one party. But I want to mention one other issue that's very relevant to this. Deindustrialization. Nations like the United States and Australia, we have to make things. We can't allow our industrial base to continue to be atrophied. And this is something, again, the U.S. Council has worked on for many, many years. If you lose your manufacturing, you lose the next generation innovation. What happened to us in about 2007 when we deployed our natural gas? For the first time, We had major infrastructure of basic industry plants built in the United States that they had all gone offshore because of energy prices. Power is everything. And so having your natural gas to power industrial development and building things here is very, very significant. So I think it's a very high priority, but I think it has to be done in a bipartisan way. Our CHIPS Plus Science Act on semiconductor revitalization, that was all done with Republicans and Democrats. So that's your challenge, how to change the narrative.
Yeah, very good point. First class, and just very quickly, I'll make one sentence, one comment. If we did process uranium and became a nuclear powerhouse in Australia, there are more jobs. So it must be aligned with the labour movement. Must be some more jobs. Now, Deborah, that was first class. Stella, we need to move on to the next topic, but thank you very much.
Thank you. But I have to say, Charles, thank you. I was supposed to be interviewing you.
Oh, really?
But we'll get to that. Thank you. But that was great. Thank you.
Okay.